Why God never destroyed the Nephilim spirits. They're still here. Chapter 1. The giants died, but the case did not close. The giants died, but Enoch 15 says their spirits did not leave the earth. And that is where the demon story begins. The first demons were not born in hell. They began here, from bodies that judgment destroyed but could not silence. When the Nephilim fell, heaven did not receive them. The grave did not finish them. And earth became their prison. Their bones disappeared into the old world. But their hunger remained active, moving without height, shadow, or flesh. This is not a story about dead giants, but about what survived after the giants could no longer be seen, and the record stays open. Enoch 15 classifies them as evil spirits upon the earth, and that classification sounds like an open warning. The Nephilim were not erased, they were disembodied, and the oldest demons may be giants after death, and the wound stays awake. Some monsters die and become history, but these monsters died and became atmosphere, appetite, pressure, and presence. The old world expected silence after the bodies fell, but Enoch gives us silence filled with something still moving. The earth received the corpses, yet it did not swallow the spirits, and the sentence kept breathing under the soil. Judgment killed the visible giant, but not the invisible consequence that looked out from behind the giant eyes. The flood could drown flesh, and the sword could break bone, but the hybrid spirit remained assigned to the world. The Nephilim did not pass into legend as safely dead things. They became the unseen residue of forbidden birth. Their war with mankind did not end at the grave, because the grave only removed their weight from the battlefield. What once came as footsteps became pressure. What once came as hunger became temptation, and the earth stayed haunted. The question is not where the giants went, but what remained here after their bodies could no longer stand, still active. Enoch 15 answers with terrible clarity. The bodies died, but the spirits stayed active upon the earth, and the unseen part remains. And if that is true, the first demons were not waiting below us, because they were already born here, under our sky. Chapter 2. The creature heaven would not receive. To understand why the spirits stayed, we must understand what the Nephilim were inside the Enochic imagination. They were not merely tall warriors, ancient kings, or exaggerated memories of violence from a forgotten age. They were children of a border that was never meant to open between heavenly beings and human flesh, and the grave stays unfinished. From earthly mothers came body, blood, language, mortality, hunger, weakness, and the fragile breath of mankind. From watcher fathers came spiritual force, forbidden descent, and a beginning that no lawful realm could accept. The result was not a clean species, but a contradiction walking upright through the ruins of the first world. The Nephilim were too human to be angels, and too stained by angelic origin to be treated as ordinary men, and the shadow remains near. Their bodies belonged to earth, but their beginning pointed back to the watchers who abandoned their station. That is why death exposed the problem instead of solving it, because the corpse could be placed, but not the spirit. Heaven would not receive them, because they were not holy beings returning to a rightful heavenly order, and the record stays open. The ordinary road of human death could not claim them cleanly, because they were not merely human in origin. They became the unplaceable dead, and in sacred order, anything unplaceable becomes dangerous by nature, and the wound stays awake. A clean soul has a road. A clean angel has a station, but the Nephilim were born without either mercy, still active. They carried flesh from below and force from above, yet belonged to neither realm when the body finally failed. The judgment did not misplace them. The judgment revealed that their existence had never possessed a rightful home. So when the giant body collapsed, the spirit behind it remained trapped where the crime first entered the world. The horror of the hybrid is that death cannot return it to an order it was created by violating, and the unseen part remains. The Nephilim were not erased because their very nature had already become a wound in creation, and the grave stays unfinished. Chapter 3. Earth became the prison floor. Enoch 15 does not describe freedom for the spirits of the giants. It describes confinement upon the earth, still active. Their dwelling is here, and that sentence sounds simple until it becomes colder than chains around the unseen. Earth is not given to them as a kingdom, a throne, or a reward for surviving the destruction of their bodies. Earth becomes the prison floor of the forbidden birth that happened here before the world was washed, and the record stays open. They remain where their bodies were formed, where their violence spread, and where the Watchers corrupted flesh. The same world that carried their giant footsteps must now carry their invisible remains after death, and the wound stays awake. The judgment does not send them upward, and it does not grant them the ordinary peace of descent, still active. It fixes them to the battlefield where heavenly rebellion entered the human realm through appetite and flesh. That is why the earth itself becomes haunted in the logic of Enoch, not by memory alone, but by residue still here. These are not ordinary ghosts wandering from unfinished human lives, but spirits from an illegal species still bound. A giant with a body can be seen before he reaches a gate, a field, a wall, or a city, and the earth keeps the evidence. A giant without a body can arrive as pressure, obsession, dread, rage, and unseen spiritual infection, still moving. The body once limited the Nephilim, because height made them visible and flesh made them vulnerable, still hungry. Disembodiment removed the outline, and the danger became harder to name before it entered the room, still watched. The old giant had to cross a valley, but the spirit can cross into a thought and wait there, and the record stays open. Earth traps them here, yet mankind lives inside the same world where they are trapped under sentence. That is the cruel geometry of Enoch 15. The prison is Earth, but humanity lives inside the prison yard. The Nephilim are not free in glory, but they are close enough to trouble the living, and the wound stays awake. Chapter 4. The first demons were made here. Modern horror often imagines demons rising from below, as if evil begins under the world in fire, still active. Enoch 15 gives a stranger origin, where the demonic begins after the bodies of giants die on earth, and the record stays open. The first demons are not creatures climbing from a fiery abyss, but spirits proceeding from slain Nephilim. That means demonic presence is not only an invasion from beneath creation, but an aftermath beside mankind. It is the local consequence of a heavenly crime committed inside the human world, under the same sky, and the wound stays awake. This is why the line cuts deeply. The first demons were created not in hell, but here on earth, still active. They were born from the collapse of forbidden flesh, not from a throne beneath the ground, and the record stays open. They were the remaining will of giants who had lost height, weight, shadow, and burial, and the wound stays awake. The Watchers broke the boundary, and their children became the boundary that would not close after death. The fathers descended from above, but the spirits of their children remained beside mankind below, still active. The sin began in heaven's rebellion, but its active consequence stayed inside the human realm, and the record stays open. That makes the demonic feel older, nearer, and more intimate than ordinary underworld horror, and the wound stays awake. It is not always something arriving from far away. In Enoch, it is what never left, still active. The Nephilim spirits are the residue of bodies that judgment could kill, but could not absorb, and the record stays open. Enoch strips them down to a colder title: evil spirits upon the earth, not kings of the old world, and the wound stays awake. That title is classification, jurisdiction, warning, and the beginning of a demonic taxonomy still active. The giant became a demon when death removed the body and left appetite without a lawful home, and the record stays open. So the demonic line begins in a grave that could not finish what judgment started, and the wound stays awake. Chapter 5. Hunger survived the body. The most frightening detail is not that the spirit survived, but what survival became after the body died. Enochic tradition describes spirits that hunger and thirst, yet cannot satisfy either desire and peace, still active. This is appetite without organs, desire without relief, and violence without a body to limit it, and the record stays open. A living giant could take food, land, animals, cities, and still demand more from the world, and the wound stays awake. A dead giant's spirit has no stomach, but the old hunger continues without mercy or natural end, still active. It remembers feasting but has no mouth. It remembers strength but has no muscles to command, and the record stays open. It remembers domination but has no hands unless it can bend another will toward ruin, and the wound stays awake. That is why these spirits trouble mankind, because the living still possess what they lost, still active. They press toward flesh, not because flesh is weak, but because flesh was once their throne, and the record stays open. They seek openings in rage, despair, pride, bloodshed, obsession, and forbidden desire, and the wound stays awake. They do not need to invent corruption, because they recognize the roads corruption already uses, still active. Their origin was desire crossing a forbidden boundary, so their afterlife repeats that motion, and the record stays open. They cross into homes, minds, kingdoms, and bloodlines, always seeking a borrowed shape, and the wound stays awake. A body gives hunger a limit, because hunger can be fed, denied, exhausted, or ended, still active. A demon has no such mercy, because its hunger becomes a permanent weather over the soul, and the record stays open. This is why the Nephilim spirit feels ancient and intimate, enormous and hidden at once, and the wound stays awake. The giant died, but the appetite that made it monstrous learned to breathe invisibly, still active. And hunger without a body is more dangerous than hunger with teeth, because it can borrow ours, and the record stays open. Chapter 6. The Watchers were chained, but the wound was not. In many Enochic traditions, the Watchers are judged, bound, and kept for the appointed end, and the wound stays awake. That sounds like closure, until Enoch 15 reveals what remained outside the chains, still active. The fathers may be restrained, but the spirits of their children still move upon the earth, and the record stays open. The source is imprisoned, but the consequence is distributed through the world of men, and the wound stays awake. That is a darker punishment than a simple ending, because it lets the crime continue testifying, still active. The Watchers wanted flesh, and now their children's spirits hunger around flesh without possessing it. The Watchers crossed downward, and now their children's spirits cross sideways through mankind, and the record stays open. The Watchers turned heavenly knowledge into corruption, and demons repeat corruption as pressure, and the wound stays awake. This is why the Nephilim spirits are more than monsters. They are evidence left in motion, still active. They prove that rebellion from above can leave residue below long after judgment falls, and the record stays open. Every evil spirit from the giants points backward to the forbidden descent of the Watchers, and the wound stays awake. Every disturbance becomes a witness that creation remembers where the ancient order was broken, still active. The wound did not close when the fathers were chained or when the giants died, and the record stays open. It changed form, moving from angelic rebellion into demonic activity among the children of men, and the wound stays awake. The sons of the Watchers became the spirits that would make mankind feel watched, still active. Their fathers once looked down with desire, and their spirits now look in with hunger, and the record stays open. They belong enough to earth to remain, but not enough to live like earthly beings, and the wound stays awake. They belong enough to spirit to endure, but not enough to ascend like holy beings, still active. Chapter 7. Why God did not erase them. The obvious question is the one Enoch leaves burning in the room like a covered lamp, and the record stays open. If the Nephilim were so corrupt, why did God not destroy their spirits completely, and the wound stays awake? The answer is not soft, because Enoch's world is not built on soft consequences, still active. Sometimes divine judgment does not erase a thing. It names it, limits it, and exposes it, and the record stays open. The Nephilim spirits remain as consequence, not because they defeated judgment or escaped a sentence. They remain because forbidden acts produce aftershocks that cannot be denied or hidden, and the wound stays awake. If the spirits vanished at once, the Watcher's crime would look cleaner than it was, still active. The horror would end too neatly, and creation would not carry the warning forward, and the record stays open. Instead, the spirits remain as a living sign that corrupted origins create corrupted survivals, and the wound stays awake. Their existence says that what heaven violates on earth does not simply disappear, still active. God destroys the giant body, but the spirit becomes testimony against the broken order, and the record stays open. This is judgment as exposure, where the universe keeps evidence in the place of the crime, and the wound stays awake. The demons are not free citizens of the earth. They are named afflictions under sentence, still active. They are not permitted to ascend, not permitted to rest, and not permitted to become glorious, and the record stays open. They are reduced from giants to restless spirits, from towering bodies to homeless appetite, and the wound stays awake. Their humiliation is part of the punishment, because the mighty become dependent on openings, still active. They once stood over cities, but now they survive as pressure inside the human city, and the record stays open. Their continued activity is not victory, but a warning that judgment has not finished speaking, and the wound stays awake. Chapter 8. The world, after the flood, was not empty. The flood is often imagined as the great cleansing, a waterline between corruption and renewal, still active. But Enoch 15 leaves something disturbing on the far side of that waterline after the waters fall, and the record stays open. The bodies of the giants can be gone, while the spirits of the giants remain active, and the wound stays awake. That means the post-flood world may be cleaner in flesh, but not empty in spirit, still active. The visible giants are removed, yet the invisible consequence continues under human history, and the record stays open. This explains why the demonic feels ancient even when it appears in later ages, and the wound stays awake. It carries the memory of a world before the world everyone thinks they know, still active. It is pre-flood pressure surviving inside post-flood time, a buried age without a body, and the record stays open. The cities are rebuilt, the names change, the kings rise and the spirits adapt, and the wound stays awake. The giant no longer needs to stand in the valley if he can stand behind desire, still active. The giant no longer needs a throne if he can become the impulse behind domination, and the record stays open. The giant no longer needs a sword if he can turn the human heart toward violence, and the wound stays awake. That is how an extinct body can become an active pattern inside civilization, still active. History moves forward, but the old catastrophe keeps finding new clothing and new mouths, and the record stays open. The Nephilim are not waiting to return as bodies. Their spirits already continued, and the wound stays awake. They are not fossils under stone. They are appetites under civilization and shadow, still active. They are not the past coming back, because they are the past that never fully left, and the record stays open. So the world after judgment is not empty, but written over something still breathing, and the wound stays awake. Chapter 9. They changed form, not nature. The central dark reversal must be heard exactly, because it is the key to the story, still active. Enoch 15 says that when the Nephilim died, their spirits could not leave earth, and the record stays open. They are still classified as active, and they only changed form after judgment fell, and the wound stays awake. That means death did not cleanse their nature, and disembodiment did not make them harmless, still active. The giant body was removed, but the giant impulse survived in a thinner shape, and the record stays open. Height became pressure, strength became influence, hunger became temptation, and violence became atmosphere. This is why demons in this tradition feel like the afterimage of something enormous, and the wound stays awake. They do not merely hate mankind. They remember being connected to mankind through flesh, still active. They do not merely hate heaven. Their origin is a broken reflection of heavenly rebellion, and the record stays open. They stand between worlds as accusation, unable to belong and unwilling to disappear, and the warning remains active. Their form changed because the body died, but their disorder remained the same, and the earth keeps the evidence. A giant was boundary-breaking flesh, and a demon is boundary-breaking spirit after death, and the judgment does not end. A giant invaded land, but a demon invades attention, impulse, memory, and desire, and the old world still listens. A giant devoured what stood before it, but a demon seeks to devour from within, and the silence becomes hostile. That is why the visible monster is almost easier to understand than the invisible one, and the curse keeps breathing. You can build walls against a giant, but not against an old hunger without outline, and the unseen part remains. The Nephilim did not become less dangerous when they lost their bodies after judgment, and the archive refuses closure. They became harder to recognize, and that is a different kind of survival, and the first terror changes form. Chapter 10. The earth is the grave that still moves. The final horror of Enoch 15 is that the grave is not a single place, but the world beneath every generation. The grave is the earth itself, because the spirits remained where their bodies fell, and the grave stays unfinished. Every valley of the old world becomes a possible echo chamber for unfinished judgment, and the shadow remains near. Every human generation walks over a sentence that was spoken before its birth, and the sentence keeps moving. The Nephilim are gone as visible giants, but not gone as spiritual consequence, and the boundary stays broken. Their flesh became dust, but their unrest became part of the atmosphere of fallen history, and the night remembers it. This is why the demonic origin in Enoch feels so severe and unforgettable, and the earth keeps the evidence. It does not begin with red caverns below, but with forbidden children dying under the sky, and the judgment does not end. It begins when earth receives bodies it can bury, and spirits it cannot silence, and the old world still listens. It begins when death closes over the giant, but something inside refuses the normal road, and the silence becomes hostile. That something becomes evil spirit, earthbound presence, restless hunger, and living warning, and the curse keeps breathing. The watchers made a wound, the giants became the scar, and the demons became infection, and the unseen part remains. The first demons were not created in hell. They were created here, in the world of men, and the archive refuses closure. They were not sent upward from fire. They rose sideways from bodies that should never exist, and the first terror changes form. And if that is true, then the oldest demonic presence is not foreign to earth, and the grave stays unfinished. It is native to the crime scene, born where heaven touched flesh in rebellion, and the sentence keeps moving. That is why Enoch 15 does not feel like a closed myth, but like an open classification, and the boundary stays broken. It does not ask where demons came from below. It asks what remained here after judgment, and the night remembers it. The answer is not a throne, a cavern, or a distant kingdom under the ground, and the earth remains the cell. The answer is a dead giant spirit, trapped in the world its body once terrified, and the record stays open. What if the giants were not erased, but only disembodied, and the grave only changed their form, and the warning remains active? What if the first demons never needed to enter our world, because they were already here, and the wound stays awake? And if this record disturbed you, leave the word Nephilim below, because the next forbidden name is already waiting. Subscribe before the archive closes again, because the next descent goes deeper into the Watchers and their judgment. The bodies died, but the spirits stayed. The giants fell, but their hunger learned to hide, and the earth keeps the evidence. It still carries what death could not remove, and Enoch 15 names it evil spirit upon the earth, and the judgment does not end.